June 6, 1944. Over the dark coastline of Normandy, thousands of Allied paratroopers descended through moonlit clouds, their mission to secure vital crossroads behind enemy lines before the beach landings at dawn. Among them was Private First Class Benjamin Ellis of the 101st Airborne, who glanced down at his uniform with absolute confidence that German searchlights would never catch him. The special fabric treatment would render him practically invisible. Little did he know that this confidence wasn't merely propaganda, but the result of one eccentric British tailor's obsession that would save countless lives that night. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a single civilian's revolutionary fabric treatment transformed airborne warfare, saving thousands of paratroopers from becoming easy targets, and how this innovation would permanently alter military technology, while proving that sometimes the greatest weapons of war aren't weapons at all. Reginald Harrow stood in his modest tailor shop on Savile Row in London on a dreary afternoon in February 1943, meticulously inspecting a standard-issue British paratrooper uniform. At 57 years old, with thinning grey hair and spectacles that never seemed to sit straight on his nose, Harrow had been a master tailor for nearly 4 decades. His hands, weathered but steady, traced the coarse fabric of the jump smock as Royal Air Force Group Captain William Morton looked on with undisguised impatience. "You understand the urgency of the matter, Mr. Harrow?" Morton asked, his voice tense. He was a tall man with a severe countenance that had been hardened by years of war planning. "Our boys are being slaughtered in the night drops. Jerry's searchlights pick them up like moths in a beam. Once spotted, they're sitting ducks for the flak guns." Harrow nodded solemnly. "I understand completely, Captain, but I still don't see how a tailor can solve what sounds like a tactical aviation problem." Morton's eyes narrowed. "Because it's not just tactical, it's textile. The Germans have developed a new type of searchlight with unprecedented power and accuracy. Our intelligence suggests they're using something called detection amplification technology. When these lights hit our current uniforms, the fabric practically glows, making our men visible for miles." In his workshop behind the main shop, Harrow examined fabric samples under various light conditions. His assistant, Eliza Winters, a young woman who had come to work for him after her husband was killed at Dunkirk, stood nearby taking notes. "The problem, Miss Winters," Harrow explained, "is that conventional fabrics reflect light in predictable ways. When a searchlight beam hits a standard uniform, it bounces back in what we call specular reflection, like a mirror. What we need is something that diffuses that reflection, scatters it in all directions so that very little returns to the source." Eliza looked up from her notebook. "Like how black velvet seems to absorb light." Harrow's eyes lit up. "Precisely. But we need something far more effective than black dye, which still reflects some light. We need something that can trap light within the fabric structure itself." Over the next several weeks, Harrow experimented with dozens of fabric treatments and dye combinations. The workshop became a chaotic laboratory of beakers, chemicals, and fabric swatches. His neighbors began to whisper about strange smells emanating from the shop at all hours. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Oberleutnant Klaus Weber of the German Luftwaffe stood on the coastal defense position near Caen, France, supervising the installation of the newest generation of Würzburg radar-guided searchlights. At 34, Weber had risen quickly through the ranks due to his engineering background and innovative approaches to air defense. "These new models have a detection range of nearly 15 kilometers under ideal conditions," Weber explained to a group of operators. "The reflector design concentrates the beam to such an intensity that even a parachute thread will shine like silver. Combined with our radar systems, we can track and illuminate targets with unprecedented precision." Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, a veteran searchlight operator, looked skeptical. "We've heard these claims before, Herr Oberleutnant. The British have been dropping their men in darker uniforms for months now." Weber smiled confidently. "That's why these aren't just brighter, they're smarter. The light itself is modified to exploit the properties of the fabric weaves commonly used in Allied uniforms. Our scientists in Berlin have studied captured examples extensively. The wavelength of the light is calibrated specifically to maximize reflection from their materials." Back in London, After many failed attempts, Harrow stumbled upon a promising approach while having his evening tea. He watched as his wife Margaret applied a face cream that seemed to vanish into her skin rather than sitting on the surface. "What is that you're using, dear?" he asked suddenly. Margaret looked surprised at his interest. "Just my cold cream. It's that new formula with lanolin that absorbs completely. Why do you ask?" Harrow set down his cup with excitement. "It's not reflecting light the way most creams do. It's penetrating the surface and dispersing underneath." He hurried to his workshop, his mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, Harrow began experimenting with lanolin-based compounds mixed with various dyes and chemical treatments. After several days of intensive work, he developed a waxy substance that, when applied to fabric, created a microscopic structure that trapped and diffused light rather than reflecting it. When Morton returned to the shop 2 weeks later, Harrow was waiting with several treated uniform samples. "I believe we've found something promising, Captain," Harrow said, leading Morton to a darkened back room where he had set up a powerful lamp. "This light is roughly 1/5 the intensity of a German searchlight, but it will demonstrate the principle." Harrow hung 2 identical paratrooper uniforms side by side. When he switched on the lamp, the difference was immediately apparent. The untreated uniform glowed brightly, while the treated one seemed to absorb the light, appearing as little more than a dark silhouette. Morton stared in astonishment. "Good God, man, it's practically invisible." Harrow nodded, unable to hide his pride. "The treatment creates thousands of tiny pockets within the fabric weave. When light hits it, instead of bouncing back, it gets trapped and scattered within these pockets. We've reduced reflectivity by approximately 85% in laboratory conditions." Morton circled the uniforms, examining them from different angles. "And this treatment, it won't affect the functionality of the uniforms, the durability, the flame resistance." "That was the tricky part," Harrow admitted. "The first few formulations made the fabric too stiff or compromised its strength. But this latest version maintains all the original properties while adding our invisibility effect. It adds only 6 ounces to the total weight." "How quickly can you scale this up?" Morton asked, already thinking ahead. "We have thousands of men who'll need treated uniforms." Harrow hesitated. "That's where we face our greatest challenge. The process is currently labor-intensive and requires careful application. I would need additional facilities, staff, and materials." Within days, Harrow's modest tailor shop was transformed into a small production facility. The British Ministry of Supply classified the project under the code name Operation Shadowcloth and provided Harrow with resources that would have been unimaginable just weeks before. Dozens of workers, mostly women who had previously worked in the fashion industry, were quickly trained in the specialized application technique. Large vats of the treatment compound bubbled in what had once been neighboring shops, now connected through hastily constructed doorways. Security was tight, with military police checking identification at all entrances. Across the Atlantic, Major Robert Lindbergh of the United States Army Airborne Command received a classified briefing at Fort Benning, Georgia. At 41, Lindbergh had been instrumental in developing American airborne tactics, though he was frequently frustrated by the High Command's conservative approach to new technologies. "This British innovation sounds promising, sir, but are we certain it works?" Lindbergh asked General Matthew Ridgway, who had just returned from a coordination meeting in London. Ridgway nodded. "The British have conducted 3 small-scale test drops over occupied France with treated uniforms. Casualty rates were reduced by 70% compared to similar operations with standard equipment. Our observers were impressed." Lindbergh reviewed the technical specifications. "And we're confident this isn't just a psychological effect. The men believing they're invisible so they fight better?" "The RAF filmed the tests from observation aircraft," Ridgway replied. "The footage is remarkable. You can clearly see German searchlights sweeping right past the treated jumpers, unable to get a fix on them. We're implementing this immediately for all American airborne units slated for the invasion." As production ramped up on both sides of the Atlantic, Harrow worked tirelessly to refine the formula. The treatment was soon being manufactured in converted textile factories across Britain and at several facilities in New Jersey and Massachusetts. The security around the project was intense. Workers were told they were applying a new type of fire retardant. Only a handful of people knew the true purpose of the treatment. Rumors inevitably spread, however, with some workers whispering that they were creating ghost suits for a secret invasion. In April 1944, Sergeant James Donnelly of the 82nd Airborne Division sat in a briefing room at an airbase in southern England, listening to his commanding officer explain the new uniforms they would be wearing for the upcoming operation. "The fabric has been treated with a classified compound," the officer explained. "We can't tell you exactly how it works, but it will make you significantly less visible to enemy searchlights. This gives us a critical advantage for the night drop," a skeptical voice called from the back of the room. "So we're jumping with magic invisibility cloaks now? What's next, flying broomsticks?" The room erupted in laughter, which the officer allowed to continue for a moment before raising his hand for silence. "I understand your skepticism, men, but this technology has been tested extensively. It's not magic, it's science, and it's going to keep a lot of you alive." After the briefing, Donnelly examined his new uniform with curiosity. It looked ordinary enough, perhaps slightly darker than the standard issue, with a faintly waxy feel to the fabric. He couldn't imagine how it would protect him from the notorious German searchlights he'd heard so much about. His friend, Corporal Michael Rodriguez, was similarly unconvinced. "Probably just some psychological warfare nonsense to boost morale," Rodriguez said as they packed their gear. "I'm still planning to land as fast as possible and find cover." Donnelly nodded in agreement. "Same here. I'm not betting my life on some Tailor's trick." Meanwhile, in a laboratory in Berlin, Dr. Werner Schultz was growing increasingly frustrated. As the lead scientist for the Luftwaffe's optical detection systems, he had been tasked with analyzing a captured British paratrooper uniform that had been recovered during a failed raid. "There is definitely something unusual about this fabric," he told his team of researchers. "Standard reflectivity tests show abnormally low values across all tested wavelengths. The effect is particularly pronounced in the frequencies used by our searchlights." His assistant, Dr. Clara Fischer, examined the fabric under a microscope. "The structure has been modified at an almost microscopic level. Look at these unusual formations within the weave. They seem designed to trap and disperse light rather than reflect it." Schultz frowned. "Can we develop a countermeasure? Perhaps recalibrate the searchlights to a frequency that this treatment doesn't affect?" After several days of testing, Fischer delivered disappointing news. "The treatment appears to be effective across the entire visible spectrum and beyond, into ultraviolet and some infrared wavelengths. We could potentially increase the power of the lights, but that would require significant modifications to our existing systems." Schultz reported their findings to Luftwaffe High Command, recommending an urgent program to upgrade the coastal searchlights. His warnings, however, were lost amid the many competing priorities in the increasingly stretched German war machine. As D-Day approached, final preparations were underway on both sides. In England, Harrow personally supervised the treatment of the last batches of uniforms, working around the clock despite his deteriorating health. "You need to rest, Mr. Harrow," Eliza urged, as she found him asleep at his workbench one morning. "You've done more than enough." Harrow shook his head stubbornly. "Every uniform we treat properly might save a life, Miss Winters. I'll rest when the job is done." On the night of June 5, 1944, thousands of paratroopers prepared to board their aircraft at airfields across southern England. Among them was Private First Class Benjamin Ellis, who had been transferred to the 101st Airborne just 3 weeks earlier. As Ellis checked his equipment one final time, his squad leader, Staff Sergeant William Harris, approached him. "First combat jump, Ellis?" Ellis nodded nervously. "Yes, Sergeant, hoping these fancy new uniforms work as advertised." Harris smiled grimly. "I've seen the test footage. They work. Just remember, nothing makes you completely invisible. Move fast, find cover, and stick to the plan." Across the channel, Oberleutnant Weber was conducting a final inspection of his searchlight positions along the Normandy coast. Recent intelligence had suggested an Allied invasion was imminent, and air defense units were on high alert. "We've doubled the coverage area with overlapping fields," Weber told his commanding officer. "If they come by air, we'll light them up like Christmas trees." In the early hours of June 6th, the invasion began. Hundreds of transport aircraft crossed the channel, carrying more than 13,000 American, British and Canadian paratroopers. As they approached the French coast, German radar stations began issuing alerts, and anti-aircraft batteries prepared for action. Ellis sat nervously in the vibrating fuselage of a C-47 transport plane, surrounded by the men of his stick. The aircraft bucked violently as it encountered flak bursts in the distance. Through the open door, he could see flashes of light below as the first German defenses engaged. "Stand up!" the jumpmaster shouted above the engine noise. "Hook up!" Ellis connected his static line with trembling hands, his heart pounding against his ribs. Ahead of him, the men of his stick formed a tense queue leading to the door. Go! 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 One by one, they vanished into the darkness. When Ellis's turn came, he took a deep breath and leaped into the void. The shock of the opening parachute jolted him, and suddenly he was floating through the night sky over occupied France. Below him, powerful German searchlights swept across the landscape, creating dazzling beams in the darkness. Ellis watched in amazement as a beam passed directly over him, but failed to illuminate his form. Instead of the bright reflection he had expected, the light seemed to slide off his treated uniform like water off a duck's back. Around him, hundreds of other paratroopers descended in eerie, near invisibility. Occasionally, a beam would catch an untreated equipment bag or exposed skin, creating brief flashes of light before moving on, unable to fix on the main target. On the ground, Feldwebel Müller was growing increasingly frustrated as he operated his searchlight. "Something's wrong with the equipment," he shouted to his assistant over the din of anti-aircraft fire. "I can see their chutes momentarily, but the men themselves are barely visible. It's like trying to illuminate smoke." All along the invasion coast, German searchlight crews reported similar difficulties. The Allied paratroopers, while not completely invisible, were proving remarkably difficult to track and target effectively. Flak batteries, deprived of clear targets, fired blindly into areas where parachutes had been briefly spotted, but their effectiveness was severely compromised. Ellis landed in a field about 2 kilometers from his designated drop zone. After quickly burying his parachute, he oriented himself and began moving cautiously toward his objective. Several times he froze as searchlight beams swept overhead, but each time they passed without revealing his position. By dawn, it was clear that the airborne landings, while scattered, had been far more successful than anticipated. Despite dropping behind heavily defended enemy lines, casualty rates were significantly lower than in previous operations. The treated uniforms had passed their greatest test. In London, Group Captain Morton personally visited Harrow's workshop to deliver the news. He found the tailor sitting wearily at his desk, having worked through the night monitoring reports as they came in. "It worked, Harrow," Morton said, his usual formal demeanor softened by genuine emotion. "Initial reports indicate paratroop casualties during the drop phase are less than 30% of what we projected. Your treatment saved thousands of lives tonight." Harrow nodded, too exhausted for celebration. "Any feedback on performance issues? Any failures we should address for future production?" "Nothing significant," Morton replied. "There were reports of some degradation in effectiveness after prolonged exposure to seawater, but that was expected and had minimal impact on the operation. As the Allied forces established their beachheads and pushed inland, the story of the invisible paratroopers began to spread. German defenders reported encounters with Allied soldiers who seemed to appear out of nowhere, contributing to a growing sense of unease among the occupation forces. In Berlin, Dr. Schultz presented his final analysis to a group of increasingly desperate military officials. "The Allied treatment appears to be a completely novel approach to counter-detection technology," he explained. "Rather than simply absorbing light like conventional dark materials, it actually disrupts the normal physics of reflection through a microscopic restructuring of the fabric surface." "Can we replicate it?" a general asked bluntly. Schultz shook his head. "Not quickly. The chemical composition is complex, and our textile industry lacks certain key components needed for mass production. Given 6 months and adequate resources, perhaps, but—" The general cut him off with a wave of his hand. "We don't have 6 months. Focus on developing an effective countermeasure instead." As the Normandy campaign progressed, The importance of Harrow's innovation became increasingly apparent. Allied commanders noted that units equipped with treated uniforms were able to conduct night operations with significantly greater success than those without. By late July, production of the treated uniforms had expanded to include not just paratroopers, but also special operations units and night-fighting infantry divisions. The formula was continuously refined, with each iteration improving on the last. For Sergeant Donnelly, who had been so skeptical before the jump, the evidence was undeniable. During a brief rest period behind the lines, he wrote to his brother, "The brass wasn't lying about these new uniforms. During the drop, Jerry's lights were all over the sky but couldn't seem to fix on us properly. I watched a beam pass right over Williams and Martinez, and it was like they weren't even there. Don't know how it works, but I'm grateful to whoever figured it out." In August, as the Allied breakout from Normandy gained momentum, Harrow received a visit from an unexpected guest. A jeep arrived at his shop carrying Brigadier General James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne, who had made a special trip to London specifically to meet the Tailor. "Mr. Harrow," Gavin said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to meet the man who gave my paratroopers such an advantage. The success of our airborne operations on D-Day is due in no small part to your innovation." Harrow, still modest despite his achievement, shook the general's hand awkwardly. "I'm just a tailor who happened to notice something about how light behaves with certain materials, General. The real heroes are the men who jumped into combat," Gavin smiled. "Nevertheless, innovations like yours change the course of battles, which change the course of wars. History may not remember the tailor as often as the general, but perhaps it should." After the successful Allied landings in southern France in August, German High Command issued a directive acknowledging the new Allied technology and ordering adjustments to air defense protocols. Searchlight crews were instructed to look for equipment shadows and parachute outlines rather than trying to illuminate the paratroopers themselves. By this time, however, Allied air superiority had rendered many of these defensive measures irrelevant. The treated uniforms remained valuable for ground operations, particularly for small units operating behind enemy lines. In September, Harrow was summoned to Whitehall for a private ceremony. To his surprise, he found himself being presented with the King's Medal for Courage in the cause of freedom, a rare honor for a civilian. "Your contribution to the war effort represents British ingenuity at its finest," the official stated as he presented the medal. "Through the application of scientific principles to a practical problem, you have saved countless Allied lives and contributed significantly to the success of our operations." Harrow, unaccustomed to such recognition, accepted the medal with mixed emotions. "I only wish we could have developed this sooner," he said quietly. "So many young men were lost before we found the solution." As the war in Europe entered its final phases, the story of Harrow's innovation spread throughout the Allied forces. What had begun as a tightly guarded secret became something of a legend, with soldiers telling exaggerated tales of completely invisible paratroopers who could walk past German sentries undetected. The reality, while less dramatic than the rumors, was nonetheless revolutionary. The treatment reduced visibility under searchlight conditions by approximately 70 to 85%, depending on environmental factors and the angle of illumination. This was not true invisibility, but in the chaos of combat, it provided a crucial edge. After the war, many of the specific details of Operation Shadowcloth remained classified, but the general principles behind the technology found numerous civilian applications. Harrow established a small research company that adapted his wartime innovation for use in everything from outdoor clothing to specialized industrial uniforms. In 1948, he was invited to the United States to consult on the further development of low-visibility technology for the newly established U.S. Air Force. By this time, both Soviet and American military researchers were working to extend his principles into the infrared spectrum, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become modern stealth technology. Private First Class Benjamin Ellis, who had survived the war and returned to his home in Pennsylvania, often thought about that night over Normandy. In 1964, now a middle-aged high school teacher, he was interviewed for a documentary about D-Day. "I remember looking up and seeing a searchlight beam pass right through me, Like I wasn't even there, he recalled. In that moment, I felt like I had some kind of supernatural protection. Years later, I learned it was just clever chemistry and physics, but it felt like magic that night. The full extent of Harrow's contribution to the Allied victory was difficult to quantify precisely. Military historians estimated that his innovation reduced airborne casualties during the critical D-Day operations by between 30% and 40%, potentially saving as many as 4,000 lives during that operation alone. When extended to all the operations where his treated uniforms were used, the number was substantially higher. Beyond the immediate tactical advantages, the psychological impact was perhaps equally significant. The confidence it gave to Allied paratroopers, knowing they had this edge, combined with the uncertainty and fear it created among German defenders who couldn't effectively target their enemies, created ripple effects throughout the campaign. Reginald Harrow died in 1957 at the age of 71, having lived to see his wartime innovation evolve into numerous peacetime applications. His obituary in the Times made only a brief mention of his significant contributions to textile technology during the Second World War, the full details still restricted by official secrets regulations. It would be another 20 years before the complete story was declassified, revealing how a modest tailor from Savile Row had revolutionized military technology through careful observation and relentless experimentation. The principles Harrow discovered, that visibility could be dramatically reduced through microscopic manipulation of material surfaces, would ultimately lead to advances in stealth aircraft, naval vessels, and ground equipment that continue to shape military technology to this day. In a final irony, the German searchlight engineer Klaus Weber, who had been so confident in his technology's ability to detect Allied paratroopers, ended up working alongside Harrow in the 1950s, as part of an international research team developing advanced materials for civilian aviation. The greatest lesson, Weber would later write, was that we had approached the problem from exactly the wrong direction. While we were building ever more powerful lights to illuminate the enemy, Harrow simply changed the enemy's relationship with light itself. It was brilliantly simple once you understood the principle. Today, a small display at the Imperial War Museum in London contains one of the few surviving examples of a Harrow-treated paratrooper uniform. Next to it is a simple card that reads, "Sometimes the most effective weapons of war are not weapons at all, but innovations that protect those who fight." Reginald Harrow's fabric treatment saved thousands of lives and helped secure the success of the Allied airborne landings on D-Day. For the men who jumped into the darkness over Normandy that June night, the technical details of how their uniforms worked were far less important than the fact that they did work. They descended through enemy searchlight beams like shadows, landing to begin the liberation of Europe with a critical advantage that no amount of German technological superiority could counter. The story of Harrow's innovation serves as a reminder that in warfare, as in so many fields, true breakthroughs often come not from the expected quarters, from generals or weapons designers, but from individuals applying their specialized knowledge in unexpected ways. A tailor's understanding of how fabric interacts with light ultimately proved as valuable as any number of tanks or aircraft in the campaign to liberate Europe. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.